Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. Today we're going to resume our study of periods 1 and 2 of Native America and colonization as we enter episode 3 of the Chesapeake Colonies. And with this, we actually make the shift from period 1 to period 2. Now return with us now to the thrilling days of yesteryear. From out of the past come the thundering hoofbeats of Wahlberg's APUSH. History class rides again. We have 3 objectives today. By the end of this session, you should be able to do number 7, to describe the main contours of English colonization in the 17th century. And I love that description, the contours of the civilization. Number 8, you should be able to explain how Virginia and Maryland developed in their early years. And number 9, you should be able to summarize the early conflicts between natives and settlers in the Chesapeake settlements. Let's begin in Roman numeral number 7. England's stability in the 16th century was undermined by a number of religious conflicts that to us moderns seem like kind of strange fights, but really matter to the people of the 1500s. Take, for instance, King Henry VIII. Now, King Henry VIII had at one time even been commended by the Pope for a theological work that he did, and receiving the title Defender of the Faith. And then he broke with the Catholic Church over the matters of his divorce. Once that break happened, Henry VIII stole vast tracts of land and immeasurable wealth from the church as he tried to basically drive it all out of England altogether. The Church of England during Henry's time was still pretty Catholic, both in its practices and its theology, but it was not Catholic in the way that it understood its hierarchy. Whereas in Catholicism, you have the hierarchical nature of the corporate body of the church reports ultimately to the Pope. In Anglicanism, the corporate body of the Church of England reports ultimately to the monarch, to the ruling king or the ruling queen. Henry's only son was Edward, and Edward was his immediate successor. Edward had been radicalized greatly in his Protestantism. I'm having a hard time with that word today. When he took over the throne, he basically radicalizes the Church of England. He declared separate liturgies for the two churches. He tried to create separate prayer books, all in an effort to marginalize Catholics and marginalize Catholicism. Anglicanism under Edward's rule became strongly Calvinist, teaching Christian predestination. But Edward took the throne young and died young in 1553, childless, and so his half-sister, Queen Mary, took the English throne. Subpoint B. Queen Mary was the first child of Henry's first wife. So the child of Henry's first wife was Mary, and that was Catherine of Aragon. And when Henry and Catherine were married, it was a Catholic family, and Mary was raised Catholic. It was only when Catherine didn't produce a male son that he divorced her, and that led to the split between the two churches. So Mary essentially seemed to blame Protestantism for breaking up her parents' marriages and leaving her an estranged child who was legally ruled to be an illegitimate bastard. When Henry died, Parliament declared her to be next in the order of succession, which allowed her to become England's first ruling queen. And Mary, when she takes the throne, tries to really re-Catholicize England. She married the Spanish king, King Philip II, who was a Catholic, and promoted trade between the two countries. Philip was also, for the period of time of the marriage, was named King of England, whereupon he spent wildly out of the English treasury. He spent English money on foreign wars, and he nearly bankrupted the entire English crown and ruined the English economy. Mary initially, when she takes the throne, promised that she would not compel Protestants to become Catholic. But soon she went back on that and started imprisoning or executing nearly 300 Protestant leaders. Mary herself died in 1558, and she also died childless, and so her half-sister Elizabeth took the throne as the new ruling queen of England. When that happened, Philip, Mary's husband, who was also the King of Spain, was stripped of his English titles and stripped of any of his authority. So, subpoint C, Queen Elizabeth. Now, Queen Elizabeth was the child of Henry VIII's second marriage of Anne Boleyn. And Elizabeth grew up Protestant. And she tried, I think, the best way we could characterize this is that she tried to stabilize England as a Protestant country, and the Church of England approached a middle path between radical Protestantism and Catholicism. And in a lot of ways, like that, her movement of rolling back the Edwardian reforms, but also Mary's extremism, the Church of England under Elizabeth looked and felt very Catholic, with Catholic-looking churches and practices and prayers, but it was definitely Protestant in its theology and absolutely Protestant in its leadership. Her reforms angered the radical Protestants as well as the Spanish king, Philip II, whom you remember used to be the English king. Pay attention to that English and Spanish rivalry in this unit. It's going to play its way out several times for a lot of policies in the New World on both sides. Keen to the way that marriage and foreign influence had compromised her half-sister Mary's rule, Elizabeth never wed, and she never produced an heir. Elizabeth I authorized English sailors to take aggressive action against Spanish control of the Western Hemisphere. And here I'd like to introduce Francis Drake. Francis Drake was a devout Protestant and a sailor. He challenged and disrupted Spanish shipping in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Despite heavy losses in both men and ships, he captured 2 Spanish treasure ships and became the first Englishman to circumnavigate the globe. Elizabeth also supported military expeditions to extend direct English rule over Gaelic-speaking Catholic regions of Ireland. She called the Irish wild savages, and English troops brutally massacred thousands of people, perhaps we could say prefiguring treatment of Indians in North America. In 1588, under the direction of Philip, the Spanish Armada set out to restore Catholicism in England, but was defeated when a fierce storm blew up, allowing the English to claim victory. The undeclared but definitely real Anglo-Spanish War would continue until 1604, until it was basically a stalemate for both sides. When we discuss the motivations for colonization, we're going to look at primarily the English point of view because they're the colonizers, but of course let's invite Spain into the conversation as well. And the English crown had issued charters to Sir Walter Raleigh and to Sir Humphrey Gilbert to colonize America at their own expense as a business venture. And this gets us into a little clue of the English pattern for colonization, that it's not just for making profit, but there's also a certain amount of business and entrepreneurship that gets involved with it. And in 1587, Sir Walter Raleigh financed an expedition to establish Roanoke as a colony with around 120 people in what's today modern-day North Carolina. Raleigh never himself actually went to the colony, but he's credited with its leadership. There, they built a fort and stocked it with supplies, and part of the expedition returned back to England to go restock what was the Roanoke colony. They returned a couple of years later. They were delayed by the Anglo-Spanish War, and the leaders then found the settlement fortified, actually not that far from what they had left it from, but they found the settlement fortified but abandoned. Now, the history of the Roanoke colony remains a mystery to historians. The conventional theory is that a lot of the settlers actually just wandered out of the colony and to go merge with the Native Americans, where there they assimilated into Indian culture. Number 2, anti-Catholicism had become deeply ingrained into English popular culture, especially after the 1588 defeat of the Spanish Armada. But Philip, the English king, shrugged off that defeat, and he continued to spend Spanish-American gold on religious wars. This ill-advised policy diverted resources, it weakened Spain's economy, and it inspired somewhere around 200,000 Castilians, fearful of taxation and fearful of getting conscripted into the Spanish army, to leave the richest region of Spain altogether and to migrate to America. Subpoint E. By contrast, England's economy was stimulated by a rise in population, going from about 3 million people, more or less, in 1500 to 5 million people in the year 1630. And also spurred on by mercantilism. Mercantilism will become an important piece of American history for at least the next 100 years or so. And it's important that you understand how this works. Mercantilism is an economic policy that tries to maximize a country's exports while minimizing its imports. Mercantilism tries to make a country sell a lot of things but buy very few things. And to do so, it uses high tariffs on imports, but also subsidies on traded goods. And countries with colonies use those colonies to extract primary or secondary goods while rarely importing cheaper foreign-made goods. The result is that people that lived in the colonies lived really expensive lives. All their best stuff was sent out to other countries. All their stuff that they would need, if it was imported at a high price. And so little came back, at least legally, in return. England's most important product was textiles. And textiles relied on a mode of production called outwork. Where it happened is that English landowners would raise sheep, especially the big estate owners that would have a lot of ground. They would raise the sheep, they would shear the sheep, and then the wool was sold to wool merchants. Then the wool merchants would go take all of this shorn wool and then use the work of landless peasants who worked in their own homes, like in their, what is the equivalent of their living rooms, to take this raw wool and to spin it into thread. And they would spin the wool into thread and then weave the threads into cloth. The government would even actually go so far as setting a maximum wage to the thread makers and the weavers. It's not a minimum wage, it's a maximum wage. This is the most you can pay them, which kept low textile prices because weavers can't go negotiate for a higher price. But it also, the result was that it kept poor people in poverty. And mercantilist-oriented monarchs, people like Elizabeth I, they encouraged investment in things like domestic manufacturing. That helped increase English exports, and it also helped decrease imports. And by the year 1600, mercantilist policies helped England to challenge Spain's control over what was American wealth, as England established a greater colonial empire in the New World. While Spain made it rich with extractive policies of mining, England was also making it rich with policies like exporting of raw materials. The economic growth was mostly limited, though, to the richest parts of England, and the wealth didn't trickle down to the poor peasantry. The living and the working conditions of just poor peasants working in England worsened, and it plunged ultimately the poor into an increasing social crisis. Authorities saw unemployed men as a danger to society. If you have a lot of people that aren't earning work, that was seen as socially dangerous. And unruly poor people were encouraged to leave England altogether to go find work in the New World. The English increasingly viewed America as a land where a man could control his own labor and gain independence, particularly by owning land. Roman numeral number 7. Between 1607 and 1700, more than 500,000 persons left England. They were driven by economic changes, by religious turmoil, or by political instability. There they settled in Ireland, the West Indies, and North America. The majority of settlers in North America were young. They were young single men from the bottom rungs of English society. The early 17th century American settlements, though, they weren't self-sustaining. They constantly needed constant immigration and imports to survive. And let's say or pick up the story of subpoint B of the Jamestown settlement. While Spanish settlements in the New World were these government-owned extractive mining or ranching organizations, the English model worked more like a business, where privately organized groups would go and build their own colonies for their own profit. Initial English colonies like Roanoke, which we've previously discussed, were these poorly funded attempts that ultimately ended in disaster. That changed after the year 1600, when merchants established the Virginia Company of London for expansionary purposes. And in 1606, King James I granted them a trade monopoly in what's today present-day North Carolina. And it ran from North Carolina all the way to what's now southern New York. They named it Virginia in memory of Elizabeth I, the never-married Virgin Queen. And in 1607, the Virginia Company sent an expedition of men to Jamestown. The Virginia Company's goal was trade, not settlement. And most of the men were English gentlemen. The truth is that they had very little survival skills at all. They hoped to get rich quickly and then return to England. They weren't long haulers in the New World. If not for the Powhatan Indians who gave their help in the early years, the settlement probably would have failed due to disease or starvation. The Jamestown settlement is going to come on a particular piece of land. It was surrounded on water by 3 sides. So it's a peninsula that sticks out, and then it was far inland. Jamestown was easily defensible. The Jamestown settlers were always afraid that the Spanish settlers would come, like the Spanish would come through and try to conquer them, so they wanted to have a defensible position. The problem is that it lacked good fresh water. And once they had a hard time getting good water, famine and illness and sometimes war with the Native Americans took a sharp toll in the Jamestown settlement. life in Jamestown was pretty harsh. The death rates were high, there was no gold, there was little food, and by 1610, just a couple of years after arriving, only 65 of the original settlement actually remained. John Smith emerged as the leader, and the tough leadership of John Smith held the early colony together. Faced with food shortages, Smith helped try to get food from the Native Americans, and when they wouldn't easily negotiate with him, he moved to threats of military force to force them to comply. He put down a rebellion of his own people with a policy of work or don't eat, a policy that improved conditions. The settlers, when they arrived, they expected to get tribute from the natives, but Chief Powhatan expected tribute from the English in exchange for supplying food. Disputes over who would pay whom resulted in poor relations and eventually resulted in warfare. Tobacco became the basis of economic life. Tobacco was the source of revenue for the royal treasury, and it became a reason to have permanent settlement in Jamestown. We might say that tobacco was Virginia's gold, and it emerged as the source of wealth for this planter class. The expansion of tobacco production led to an increased demand for field labor, and that's where our story really gets rich. To encourage English settlement, the Virginia Company said, hey, if you're a freeman, why don't you come and establish in Virginia? And they established this land dispersal system and a local court system. They even went as far in Virginia as establishing a representative government. They called it the House of Burgesses. Remember that name. It'll become very important soon. The House of Burgesses becomes the legislature of the Virginia colony. And by 1622, English settlement in Virginia included 4,500 new recruits as we see the population booms. Subpoint C. To maximize production, planters in the Chesapeake Bay consolidated land into ever fewer hands. So fewer and fewer people control the land in the Chesapeake Bay. They experimented with different labor systems like indentured servitude and the beginnings of what begins to be slavery. The Virginia colony began indentured servitude starting in 1609, where planters paid the cost of immigration. So if a person was growing tobacco and they could hire out somebody from the old country to come move in, they would do so by paying the cost of the immigration to do so. So the Virginia colony began indentured servitude in 1609, and planters paid the cost of immigration. They also paid for the food and lodging of the people who would travel to England to go work for a particular contract. The contract year usually ran from 4 to 7 years in Virginia's tobacco fields. The specifics of the contract would vary based on the person that was negotiating, but most people were promised a certain amount of free land at the end of their contract. And it turned out it was excellent timing. The 30 Years' War left Europe's economy in absolute shambles. With widespread unemployment, up to 2/3 of immigrants who came to the colonies, they arrived as indentured servants. Indentured servants were mainly the poor people of England. They come from the lower class of English society, and therefore they had very little to lose by immigrating out of England and coming to the New World. A good servant, if a person was a good worker, a good servant could earn their expenses in about a year's worth of labor, which made it a very profitable business for the person that was fronting the money on the way in. But the system was hard, and the system was particularly hard on newly arrived servants. The poor living conditions, the poor working conditions, there was bad treatment for the indentured servants. Diseases like malaria. Malaria travels with mosquitoes, so the swampy lands of the American South, they were particularly ripe with it. The diseases like malaria, they kept population low, and sadly, life expectancy was very short. Although 15,000 people from England arrived in Virginia in the years between 1622 and 1640, 16,000 people arrived, but the population only grew from 2,000 to 4,000, or about 6,000 souls in that same period. Most indentured servants, they came hoping for a better life. They didn't achieve the escape from poverty that they had sought. Although about 25%, about 1 in 4 indentured servants actually benefited from their ordeal, acquiring property and respectability, most people didn't. Most people didn't do so. Female servants had a better shot at it. Female servants generally fared better. Sometimes they even married property planters, but for working men, this was a hard row to hoe. Subpoint D. Immigration jumped in 1618 when the Virginia Company introduced what becomes known as the headright system. The headright system offered 50 acres of land to adventurers, and I love that term, to adventurers who paid their own expenses or paid for somebody else's immigration expenses. The system was initiated in Virginia, but was adopted in Georgia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, and in Maryland. And in most cases, the way the headright system worked was that a rich English gentleman would sponsor some particular indentured servant. So because he's the one that paid for it, the indentured servant would go do the work, but the gentleman would claim the land and claim the 50 acres for himself, and sending the servant to go do the work. That way, he would get rich on American land, but not actually have to go put in the sweat to turn it into productivity or make the long Atlantic journey for himself. A good servant could actually go produce more than what his purchase price was in a single year. So if a person had the money up front to go post the capital, this turned out to be a pretty good investment. And in 1638, just as an example, one landowner purchased 60 slaves to go off to the New World and thus received 3,000 acres of land. And the more land that a family acquired, the wealthier they became almost overnight. The result was that the land ownership became concentrated into the hands of a few very wealthy families. Subpoint E. Let's talk about Maryland for a second. Maryland was established in 1632 somewhat differently than the rest of the colonies. It was a proprietary colony under the control of Celius Calvert. So it's proprietary. Essentially, Celius Calvert is the person that runs all of Maryland himself. He envisioned it as a refuge for persecuted Catholics. And most of the initial appointees were initially Catholic. But Protestants were always outnumbering Catholics in just the general colonial population. As in Virginia, tobacco came to dominate the economy, and it became to dominate the tobacco planters in the Society of Maryland. Although it had a high death rate, which is not nothing, but the high death rate in Maryland came with the servants in Maryland had a greater opportunity for land ownership than they would ever have in Virginia. Let's talk about Englishmen and Indians. English settlements presented Indians in eastern North America with the greatest crisis of their entire history. In practice, colonial authorities recognized the Indians' title to land based on their occupancy of it. But that recognition should have protected Native Americans from losing their land. In effect, though, the English emphasized displacing Native Americans from their land, and in the 17th century, the 17th century is marked by recurrent warfare between colonists and Indians. Settlers would eventually fence in more land. That more land would go and protect their own crops and livestock, but that also prevented the natural migration of animals, and it transformed the natural environment and ultimately undermined Indian agriculture. Subpoint B. Early on, the relationship between the English and the Native Americans early on were mostly peaceful. Take, for instance, Powhatan. Powhatan was the chief of 30 tribes near Jamestown. So he's a single chief over 30 tribes near Jamestown. And Powhatan eagerly traded with the English. Over time, though, relations soured. And in particular, they soured between John Smith and Powhatan. And Smith was captured. When he was captured, Powhatan himself was going to specifically execute Smith. This was a leader-on-leader approach. When Powhatan's daughter, a person you might have heard of named Pocahontas, placed her head upon Smith's, thereby saying, like, if Powhatan is going to execute John Smith, he would also execute his own daughter. Now, some historians dispute this theory, and let me caution you always to never take your American history cues from Disney films, because it's a little more complicated than that. Some historians even think that this whole thing was orchestrated and a big stunt, if it even happened at all. Pocahontas would later be captured by the English during Anglo-Indian hostilities in 1613. She was held for ransom. During her captivity, Pocahontas went and converted to Christianity. She took the name Rebecca. You don't find this in the Disney films, but she actually changed her name when she converted to Christianity. And in 1614, she married a planter named John Rolfe and moved back to England. If you watch Pocahontas 2, and you probably shouldn't, but if you watch Pocahontas 2, John Rolfe is the figure of the dog. Rolfe was an actual human. He wasn't a dog. Pocahontas didn't marry an animal, she married a human. She moved back to England where she was quite like a commodity. People were really excited to go see an actual Native American back in England until she died of disease. Yeah, that part of the story doesn't make it in the Disney films. Subpoint C. Once the English decided on a permanent colony instead of merely having a trading post, conflict was inevitable. The influx of settlers and the English suggestions that Indian children should be more like proper Christians and go to school, that sparked a war in 1622, led by a person named as Opechancanough, I think is how you say it. Opechancanough was Powhatan's younger brother, and he was the successor to the 30 tribes. After nearly a third of the English population was killed during a surprise attack, the English reacted by seizing Indian fields and food and forcing captured Indians into what's effect slavery. Shocked by the Indian uprisings, James I, King James back in England, shocked by the Indian uprisings, James I accused the Virginia Company of mismanagement. He revoked their charter, and in 1624, he said, no, Virginia cannot be a colony of the Virginia Company. It's going to be a royal colony. We're going to lead it from the top. The king then established the Church of England in Virginia. Property owners would go pay a tax to support the colony, and Virginia had brand new institutions like a royal governor, an elected assembly, and an established Anglican church. That became ultimately the model for royal colonies in America, and the Virginia Company surrendered its charter to the crown in 1624. This will change the way that the English approach their settlements in North America, which will ultimately change the pattern of American history. There's so much more, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.